when you've been basically told, not literally, but your experience has told you, you know, you're locked up, you're incarcerated, you're in the most awful conditions, and you know your life hangs by a thread. You know, you get a sense that you have to somehow make life worthwhile afterwards.
Who has influenced you most in your life?
That's such a... I've never thought about that. If I'm honest, well, I am honest. If you know, if I squeeze it until the pips drop, as it were, I think.
Welcome all. Today I am in a studio, as you will see, joined by the lovely Maurice Blik. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, this conversation is going to be a bit different today because we are, one, on location, which never happens. We're on set. And we're going to be talking a bit about Maurice's life, but also his sculpture and his book. I read your book last night, as I told you, and it was very eye-opening in terms of the adversity, the ups and downs and curveballs that you've been thrown in life. There's many, more so than anyone I've ever interviewed, actually. So you win the star, you win the award for that one.
Thank you.
Where I'd like to start, and it only makes sense to start there,
Yes.
is, I suppose, your childhood, so where you grew up, and just a bit about where your life began. So would you mind telling the audience a bit about that?
No, my life began in Amsterdam. Obviously, I was born there, and I lived there for the first 4 years of my life. With my mother and my father. I have a sister still who's a couple of years older than me, and we all lived in an apartment in Amsterdam, and my grandmother lived with us as well. And from then on, I was taken off to a place called Westerbork when Germany invaded Holland, as I'm sure you know. I was born in 1939, and as I say, when I was about 4 years old, all our family were taken off to Westerbork, which was a concentration camp in Holland, but it served as an interim camp from which people were dispatched in all different camps all over Germany and Poland and so on. And we were taken, my father was taken off from Westerbork, we believe to us, which we don't know for certain, and we never saw him again after that. And myself, my mother, my sister and my grandmother were taken to Belsen, and that's where I spent the next 18 months or so. And from there, because my mother was born English, born in this country, and spoke perfect English, she was able to persuade people, once we'd been liberated from Belsen, she was able to persuade people that she wanted to go back to England. Presumably she felt safe there, and she had family there, obviously still. And so off we went. My grandmother didn't make it. She died in Belsen, and I had a little sister called Millie who was born in Belsen and died there as well. So the three of us, my mother, my older sister Clara and myself, finished up in this country, where I've more or less been ever since.
I had a new sense of gratitude when I started reading your book. I think that there's a lot of things we take for granted in life, that even one of a bed. And you talk about when you're in Belsen that your mum and your sister shared a top bunk bed for
That's
a long
right.
time.
Yes.
Why the top?
My mother, there were 3 tiers, you know, as you say. We were on the top one, and Clara and myself slept with our heads at one end and my mother the other way. So we slept there with literally our mother's feet in our faces.
Okay.
And why the top? Because, well, my mother made that decision. I suppose she figured it was a better place to be, you know. Maybe the air was a bit better up there, but mainly because you didn't have to put up with the people above you with their bodily fluids, let's put it that way, dropping
Very
on
polite.
you. Yeah. So you were safe
Okay.
from that at least.
And your mother had your sister while you were in Belsen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, she had my little sister Millie. I don't recall it, obviously. I mean, I recall her being there, Millie being there, but I don't recall the birth or where she went. And to have the birth, it was in the hut, the barrack, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And I suspect my mother could never talk about any of that stuff. I mean, she, in later years when I was kind of teenager and growing up, and even when I was properly adult, in my 30s and 40s, she couldn't talk about any of the past. And so I don't really know where or how she gave birth, but it was obviously in the hut somewhere, and hopefully she had somebody to help her, because there were all kinds of people there, presumably midwives or doctors or nurses or medical people who might have been able to help her, but I really don't know. But Millie, yeah, she was born there and died there. It's a euphemism, isn't it? Perished and died. People use those terms. I mean, essentially she was murdered. She was kept off, she was starved to death because they didn't care,
Now, there's a pivotal point in the book, and I think I'll get to that really around sort of your sculpture. But at that time, you'd made something for your sister.
Yes.
And I suppose that's what you classed, or Jean, who was then your therapist, classed as your first sculpture.
That's right.
Which was made out of a carrot. And what was that? What was the sculpture?
Yeah, well, Millie, my little sister, her birthday would have been a few days before mine. She was born on the 9th of April. My birthday is the 21st, so I was looking forward to Millie becoming a year old, and I'm the big brother, so I found a carrot somewhere. And I mean, you probably appreciate food was incredibly scarce, and people were starving and so on. So I found this carrot somewhere, I don't know where, and I put 3 little sticks in it so that it was now a little boat with 3 masts. And I hung on to this for several days to give it to Millie, and I kept asking my mother, is it her birthday yet? And my mother would say, no, it's not, in a little while. And this, several days I'd ask. And of course, her birthday never came. So you're right, many years later I had some psychotherapy, a lady called Jean, and I obviously talked about a lot of things, one way and another, and I related this story to Jean, and she said, well, there you are, that's your first sculpture. And in a way, that, obviously I'd never thought about it in those terms. I mean, I was hoping to give my little sister, big brother's giving you a present sort of thing. And I was very angry and cross that she'd managed to die before. I mean, quite ridiculous kind of thing to think about it in those terms. But, what did I know? I was a was almost 5 years old, and this was, you know, a terrible insult to my ability to hang on to this bit of food when, you know, every bit of food was, you know, precious, essential. And so I said, you know, making sculpture many years later had always been a stressful kind of experience, although I wanted to make it for some reason. You know, I had the urge to make it, but whenever I got round to doing it, it became stressful, you know, and the idea is artists are meant to have a lovely enjoy their making their art, aren't they? They're meant to, best thing that's ever happened. But maybe for me it was this sort of will of, I will make this thing and people are going to like it, sort of, you know, to get over this unconscious difficulty that kept cropping up. So, yeah, it's obviously had a profound effect. I've never been conscious about this. When Jean said this to me, it did resonate. It, you know, rang a few bells, but it wasn't an immediate sort of, oh, now I understand. I can happily go into my studio 24/7 and make art. And gradually it's become an experience that it's about being worthwhile, I think, in life. For me, anyhow, when you've been, I don't want to ramble on about this, but, you know, when you've been basically told, not literally, but your experience has told you, you know, you're locked up, you're incarcerated, you're in the most awful conditions, and, you know, your life hangs by a thread. You know, you get a sense that you have to somehow make life worthwhile afterwards. I'll go on about this.
And you did make life worthwhile.
I hope so.
And I think you certainly didn't allow Belsen to define you.
No.
And that's where your story moved on. I think I'd just like to give the audience some idea, though, and also the next generation that are going into their history lesson, or that don't even study or understand what Belsen or the Holocaust was.
Right.
But from, so I think the death toll you mention in your book of Vietnam was around 58,000 or something like that.
Yes.
And the death toll with the Holocaust was 6 million or something like that.
Nobody's got the exact figures,
numbers,
but that's pretty much what people agree.
Yeah, and I just to provide some context for the listeners of actually, you know, how bad it was at that time. Yet you moved on. Actually, you moved to a lot of places. What I loved about reading your book is you're well-travelled. But Barbican seemed to become your favourite place of all from where you lived. But so before that, you left Belsen and you ended up in England.
Yes.
You then went on to become a teacher.
That's right.
And you did that for quite a while, didn't you?
I did, yes. 27 years, I think, is the actual number of years.
And that transition, because as a child you wanted to be a doctor.
Yes.
And I think you say in your book that actually last minute you decided that wasn't for you because you didn't want to see death anymore.
Yeah, it was death, but it was, in a way, the more significant thing was being surrounded by death, obviously, every day, and dragging corpses out of the heart and all that. But I think the more troubling thing was people that were so close to death that they couldn't really even sit up or move, and I think, yeah, you're right. When I really thought about medicine and what I'd have to deal with, which is decaying people that were on the verge of death, that were so ill that they couldn't help themselves, that was a sort of overnight reaction to the whole idea of doing medicine. But yeah, sorry, you're right.
So art was your thing. That's what excited you.
Yes, I was at school, and you know, and I was good at art, as they say. I had a girlfriend there, and the art teacher let me paint her portrait in oils, even in the art room. So there I was, and you know, lunch times and whatever, and had time and a bit after school, and I painted this portrait of her, and the art teacher, you know, or Lippet, his name was a very lovely, avuncular sort of man, and that was, he encouraged me because, you know, I suppose I was good at it. And so when I decided I wasn't going to do medicine, he was over the moon, you know, and I said, well, I'll go to art school then, you know, just like that. So he was very happy about it. And
was that at Hornsey?
Hornsey School of Art, yes, North London.
Now, I read a part in your book where you weren't accepted into, I think, one of the art classes, yet years later you actually went on to teach at that academy and that school.
Yes, I did a sculpture course at Hornsey, and then after that I applied to do the art teacher's certificate course. That's run in 3 institutions. It was run at Hornsey, it was run at Goldsmiths, and it was run at what they call the Central Institute, which is right in the middle of London, at you know, University of London complex there. And so I was at Hornsey, and I applied to do the course there because I had to think about earning a living, you know. And he turned me down.
How rude.
How rude. And then a few years later, I went and applied at the Central Institute, and they took me there, and I did the course, and then I finished up teaching on the course at Hornsey, as it were, which was then Middlesex, on the course that had turned me down. So it's sort
Such
of,
is life.
yeah.
Absolutely. And with your travel, you went to New York with your family. You decided to come back to the UK. And after working in what I understand was probably one of the roughest pubs in London, and also you worked then in a coffee shop, going on to doing renovations of properties, you met your wife, or your then wife. And what was life like for you then? Did you feel settled?
No, I've never felt settled in that sense. So the pub I worked in wasn't rough. It was run by a notorious criminal.
Okay.
You know, but it was anything but rough because.
So it's the safest place to be.
Absolutely, yeah. You didn't mess with the guy was called Ruby Sparks, who was quite notorious, but I felt as safe as anything there.
Wow.
All his, it was in Hornsey, not far from the college, and I went there for evenings, you know, pull pints and earn a few quid to sort of get by. And he was wonderful, and all his buddies were, you know, criminals more or less, and it was really a club more than anything. And yeah, I felt really protected. Nobody's going to mess with you if you know Mr. Sparks and so on. So it wasn't rough, but it was run by this guy. And from there, I left there to work in a coffee shop, one of the first sort of coffee shops that opened in London it must have been about 60 something. And they had the new wonderful espresso machine, you know, that made noise when you made an espresso, the Gadget machine. And then I got a teaching job well, I wasn't qualified at that point because I went to the institute after about 6 or 7 years of teaching and moved to Essex, where I met my first wife. And the story goes on.
And you have 2 beautiful children, don't you?
I do, yes. One of them lives at the moment, well, they both technically live in the States, but my son is a pilot and he's in Hong Kong,
Wow.
flying the biggest aircraft they make, because he won't find anything smooth. It's interesting you were talking about becoming a fighter pilot, and I'm sure there is an element in his psychology which is, you know, he wants to be able to jump on a plane,
Yeah.
you know.
I understand that feeling.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure you do. Yes, that's why I was so taken when you said that. So he's a pilot, and my daughter is in New York with her husband and her 2 kiddies.
Okay.
And she spent a lot of time working for Scientific American magazine as an illustrator, as a so
very creative as well, then.
I guess so, yes. I have trouble with that word, creative, because, well, you know, that's a whole. I lost a job because of that. I went for an interview for a teaching job at a college after I got my qualification from the institute, and my tutor set me up for this interview. It was my job, you know. And I went along there and they said, how are you going to encourage creativity amongst the students? And I said, well, creative, it's a process. It's not something you can identify or test. You know, they used to have these tests for creativity. How many uses can you think of for a house brick? And don't you dare say build a wall, because that's not creative. And I thought, well, this is nonsense, isn't it? Anyhow, I did have a bit of a...
Was this part of your book where they made heads out of paper mache?
Yeah.
And they could either put on... They put this on their head, whoever they wanted to be or they looked up to, or the person they disliked.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, this wasn't. This
wasn't that time, a different time. So you...
that was...
I like your thinking, though.
Yeah. This was when I was on the course doing my teacher's certificate thing, and you have a placement where you do what they call teaching practice, and I was in this school which was very, very traditional and old-fashioned, and you have to be a bit careful. You don't want to rock the boat too much, because otherwise they won't take any other students. Sure. You know. And I did this project with the kids. They were 15, 16-year-old boys' school, and they didn't want to paint pictures of where you'd gone on your holiday. That wasn't for them. And I had this project where I asked them to make a paper mache head that they could literally wear, and they could have either their hero or the person they disliked the most. And all the heroes pretty much were football players,
of course,
as you can imagine. And the people they didn't like at all were some of the teachers. And once they'd wearing this thing over their head, I stuck a microphone up the head and interviewed them, you know. Who are you? I'm Mr. So-and-so. Who is he? Oh, he's a horrible bloke, and he's my maths teacher. Well, when you do that, you know, you cover somebody, they think they can't be seen, as it were, and all their inhibitions go. And I mean, this stuff was, I didn't show it to the teachers at school because it was really dynamite.
I mean, they'd have been expelled.
Well, the kids would have got into trouble, and I would have been thrown out of school.
Course.
And as far as any other students going there, that would have been it, you know.
So at 37,
yes,
there was, I suppose, a bit of a shift in your life.
yeah.
But just before that point, your wife was also a sculptor.
Potter.
A potter,
Yeah.
pottery.
Mm.
And she was asked to do a job of something to do with the horse's head, wasn't it?
Yes.
And in your book, you say that you went downstairs into your house or whatever, wherever that was, the workshop, and you put together a horse's head and you took it up just as an idea.
Yes.
and you went on then to commission some of those. But can you tell us about the significance really of that horse's head? Because I think that plays a pivotal part in your story.
I'd been married for something like 14 years, I think, and my wife, as you say, she had a pottery, quite a successful pottery business, mainly doing domestic ware, jugs and casseroles and beakers and so on and so forth. And she had a client who bought her stuff. He had an outlet, a craft outlet, but his main business was making saddles and horse. He didn't physically make them. He had people working making them. And so he wanted to promote his business by giving a prize, a trophy for the young equestrian of the year, young rider of the year. And he didn't want to give a shield or a cup. He wanted a horse head. And so she, obviously being a potter, worked with clay all the time. And so he came to see her. They were chatting. I was sitting there having a coffee with them in the kitchen. And he said, look, and she started doing some sketches of what the horse head might look like. And I had a rush of blood to the head, I suppose. I hadn't touched clay for like 15 years. I wasn't an artist. I wasn't a sculptor anymore. I was a teacher. Anyhow, I had this rush of blood to the head, and I went down to her pottery, which was in the sort of semi-basement of the house we had in Muswell Hill. And I got some clay, and I made some little heads about this big, about half a dozen of them, just modelled them in clay. And I did it really quickly, surprise. And I thought this would help them, get their ideas together. So I brought it up to where they were sitting, and they were both a bit taken aback. And one thing led to another, and he said, well, why don't you do the head for the trophy? And I said, I don't do that, I don't do sculpture, Anyhow, he persuaded me eventually to do it. And so I made this horse head about this big, whatever that. And that was, in fact, a trophy. And it was a purely intuitive thing, making these horse heads. I don't know anything about horses. I don't ride. I know nothing about their anatomy and stuff like that. It was just a purely unconscious, subconscious, I don't know what the term is, intuitive, made these little heads, about half a dozen of them. And having made this one for the trophy, our marriage sort of wasn't in a great shape to start with, and I don't think this helped. And I did, not long after that, I left the matrimonial home, as lawyers like to call it, and went off and rented a place. And I was fortunate enough where I rented a room from somebody, and they had a little shed in the garden. And she said, if you want to go in there and do some work. So I started making more of these heads, because the one I'd made was seen by a lady who was a buyer for heels. And she used to buy my wife's pottery for heels. And she'd seen this head sitting in the pottery waiting to be fired, and said, why don't you make some for our art gallery, which Heels had at the time. Heels, it's on Tottenham Court Road, quite a high-end furniture place had an art gallery. So I started making some more of these things, and they went into the Heels Art Gallery, and I was making them in this little shed at the bottom of the garden, carrying them gingerly to where I was teaching, where there were kilns and things. And then later on, when I was having psychotherapy with Jean, she said, what are you doing with yourself? So I thought, well, I'm making these horse heads. They seem to like them. They're selling them at Heels and so on. And I showed her some photographs, and she made one of her focused insights that really hit me. And she said, well, there you are, that's the second time the horses have rescued you. I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, you told me when you were taken out of Belsen on this train, they were clearing the camp, and the train was intercepted by Cossacks, you know, obviously on horseback, and they were your rescuers. And so this image burned into your memory or whatever. And these horses represented freedom, obviously the Cossacks as well, but seeing them riding, I mean, it's like the old B movies you used to get in the movies where the cavalry ride over the hill and rescue them. And it was like that, you know. And so Jean said, well, first of all, she told me what my first sculpture was, which was the carrot that I wanted to give to Millie. And now she said, you're making, you know, these sculptures that represent your liberators.
Yeah. And I suppose at the time that happened, especially with the separation of your wife and moving out of your marital home, it seems that that horse had played quite a significant part of your saviour sort of before and even maybe where you were then in life. Why did you decide to go to psychotherapy with Jean? Why did you decide to talk to her?
Well, this was obviously, I was going through the divorce, and there's obviously a lead up to it with things that are not pleasant in any way, shape or form, and I had 2 kids. At that point, I still got 2 kids, but, you know, I had my 2 by then. And I was really miserable and unhappy, and I was living in a little room in a bed-sitter, and my son was then about 11 years old, and my daughter was a couple of years younger, 3 years younger. And I thought I need to do something to get my life back on track. And I thought, I can't do this by myself. So, as I'd been a student at the University of London, you know, the Institute of Education, there was a health service there, as you probably know, and Jean was the person there, one of the people there, and so I thought maybe she can help. So I went to see her, obviously, and the first meeting we had was, you know, why have you come to see me, sort of thing. I'm very unhappy, you know, so I related, you know, I wasn't happy, I wasn't, you know, I was, and then she said, well, what about your family, you know, other than my kids and my wife then? And I said, well, my mother lives in the States and my sister's there as well. And she said, what about your father? And I said, I don't know what happened to him. And so she said, well, what do you think? So I briefly said, well, he was with us in Westerbork, and he was shipped off, we think, to Auschwitz, but we don't really know, and tried to find out whether there's any record of his, you know, having had numbers, and there's nothing, so I don't know, but I think he's dead. And that really unlocked so much, and she started, obviously after that, we had regular meetings, and gradually stuff started to make sense, and the more I was able, in a sense, to put that experience, to articulate those experiences, to recognize them in my conscious being, the more I decided, you know, I mean, I was 37, 8, 9, round about that age when I started seeing Jean. So I thought, well, I've got a day or two to go yet. Maybe, you know, my life has to get it, you know, I've got to get it together and have a life and not just sort of be miserable and unhappy. And obviously having got divorced and not seeing my kids more than, you know, occasionally, as it were, and not living with them and so on, I need to do something to get my life and give it some substance and meaning. I can't just go on, woe is me. So, yeah, that's why I decided it's...
And the reason I ask is that there are many people that don't go to get help. And even back then, actually, I didn't realise that there were services like Gene really readily available. So that was really good to read in your book, that you did understand you were in that place and you needed to get help. And actually, by doing that, you completely changed your life, sort of, again, in terms of your career, and went on to do more sculpture.
Indeed, yes.
There was, the people that I've spoken to about you, Maurice, have said that you're a very humble man, and it's the first time that I've met you today. And I have to say that I agree. And there was a point in your book where you're driving with your sculpture in the back of your car to your first potential customer or showing in London. And as you will read, that you sort of pull up and you take one of your pieces out and you put it down, and Dennis, the owner of the gallery at the time, turned around and said, "No, don't bring any more in." That's right. Immediately in your head you're thinking, "Oh, I haven't got the job." But what actually happened?
Yeah, well, pretty much as you say. I'd been making sculpture for a bit, I don't know how many years, but, a few years anyhow. And I'd got some pieces, and I'd made them in plaster because casting bronze is hugely expensive. And anyhow, they suggested I visit this gallery and show them my work, with a view, obviously, to the gallery representing me. So I'd come to this gallery, Orwin, in just off Bond Street, and I had these 3 plaster pieces in the car. I carried one in. I said hello, and I'm Maurice. So obviously, I'd made an appointment, and I've carried one in and put it down. And Dennis, the gallery owner, saw it. And I went out to get the other one or 2 in the car, and he said, "Oh, no, don't get any more." So I thought, oh, okay. So I went to pick the one up I just put down, and he said, no, come into my office. And I thought, well, okay, it's going to be nice and say, this is really not right. Not a bit of it, in this huge office with a desk half the size of my studio. And he said, "We'd like to offer you a show." And I was absolutely gobsmacked. I thought I'd been there 2 minutes. He'd seen the sculpture for 30 seconds. And I obviously assumed, well, take it away, go away. No, quite the opposite. So he offered me a solo show on the basis of one sculpture, which is, extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Couldn't quite believe it at first, but then he, very, very formal man. This is what we want. We want X number of pieces. They have to be all delivered professionally. None of this in the back of the car stuff. Mounted on slate bases and this, that, and the other. All the criteria laid down. So he said, "That's it. We'd like to do that." I was so taken aback, I couldn't even say thank you or whatever. He must have thought, very odd man, and off I went.
And at that point, did you accept that actually you were really good at this?
No.
Okay. Have you now?
I'm beginning to, Tracy. I've always been in awe when people have bought my work. It's a very difficult thing. Have I accepted it? More or less, but I'm not, I'm the greatest sculptor that ever lived, and you're honoured to buy my work attitude at all.
No, I know you're not.
Right.
I mean, you should be a little bit. But
Well, since I've been with Robert's Gallery, I must admit that my confidence has developed there. But I know quite a few sculptors, as you can imagine. I was president of the Royal Society of Sculptors for a while, so I've got to know a hell of a lot. And mainly there's this huge self-belief amongst them, because it's a ridiculous thing to do, isn't it? To spend your time, whether you carve lumps of stone or whether you model up in clay or anything, and then, you know, expect people to think it's great and buy it. But, you know, so there has to be a certain self-belief, I suppose. And many sculptors are full of that, you know, I'm the best thing to slice bread kind of attitude. But I've never had that, and I think I've always felt that I have to prove I'm worthwhile and what I'm doing is worthwhile. And I don't know, I'm not a psychologist or anything, but I suspect way back this wretched carrot still lurks in the back of my mind, the idea that because poor Millie, who obviously had no control or anything, that I was so disappointed that she wouldn't accept my present. I think there's still an element of that goes through a thread of, you know, I make these things, and if people do buy them, like them, buy them. I mean, lots of people say, oh, I love your work, but obviously not everybody buys them. I do feel a sort of vindication maybe of that business, and I don't know. It's pathetic really, isn't it? I mean,
no, not at all.
Well, anyhow.
And so, how many commissions have you successfully done now?
How many?
How many? I mean, I think most of them are in the back of the book, but...
Yeah, I haven't counted.
What are the
them
most significant ones to you?
I suppose the first one that I got, which was when I was with well, not a gallery, but an organisation that what do you call them? Anyway, art advisors, and I got a commission in Docklands, which was my first real commission, and I was still teaching at Middlesex at that point, and that was when circumstances were right. I was able to leave there and got the commission. I was still pondering whether I should leave or stay on, because at that point I was 51 or 2, I think, and so if I'd have stayed on another few years I would have done the normal route, you know, retired with the pension and all that sort of jazz. But the choice was then, well, do I leave and chance my arm that I can make it making sculpture? I got this commission for the part of, you know, regeneration of Docklands, you know, back in the whenever it was, and on the basis of that, it was a large piece. I thought, well, that's a sign that, you know, I can go for that 100%, and so I did, and I took the option of leaving Middlesex and getting this Docklands commission. So that was the first commission, really, and I've had, I don't know how many, several since then. The last one that I completed was for Cyprus, which was a lovely commission, in the sense that it came through Robert's Gallery, Bowman Gallery, for one of their clients who really loved my work, and he was building this this block of, I don't know how many stories, anyhow, quite a big office block. And interestingly, my piece that I made for him was on the outside of the building, and he loved it. So yeah, that was the last one I did. But I've had others that really resonated. I got one for there's an organisation called the Evacuees Reunion Association, and that was about, obviously, people that were evacuees during the war, you know, taken out of the towns and cities and lodged in the countryside so that they were safe from bombing and all that during the Second World War. And I was asked to do a memorial to that. And because of the time period, it was about the same time that I was obviously taken off from my home and went through the Belsen and all that. So it was a time that I could identify with, and the sense that these kids were taken out of their homes in the cities. They didn't know where they were going. Their parents didn't know where they were going. So they were bewildered and lost and unhappy. A lot of them were unhappy. Anyhow, so I made this memorial for the Evacuees Association, and that sits at the National Memorial Arboretum up in Staffordshire. And it was a wonderful experience, because when it was unveiled, a lot of the evacuees, and now obviously elderly people, came for the unveiling, and quite a few of them were in tears as they remembered and identified with these figures that I'd done. And that was really very rewarding to see these people emotionally so sort of taken by what I'd done.
I think you have, reading your book, seeing your sculpture, walking around your house and your home, for me, and I think even for the crew, you have an emotional connection with everything that you've done. You have feeling with it.
I hope so.
For me as the viewer, or even reading the book and understanding your story, there's so many emotions that you go through. Like I said to you first, the first thing for me was, wow, I'm so grateful for what I have just from reading the first couple of chapters. But then there's elements of your life in there which are quite funny, so you start to get to see your character. But also, what is really prevalent in that book is the fact that you've never been scared of change, or to change direction in life. And we talked earlier over coffee, at 79 you decided to then change what you were doing in sculpture.
Yes.
Why do you think you're that way?
I think when I think about doing something like that, as you say, the sculpture I'd been making for quite a long time, it was successful, let's put it that way. I mean, I haven't, become hugely wealthy or anything, but the sculpture sells reasonably well, and so on. So I knew the kind of thing I was doing with the gallery. They were happy with it. They sold pieces, and it's cozy. It's fine. I could go on like that indefinitely. But something, I wanted to move on and try and get closer to what I thought I would really want to externalize, want to express. Sure. And so I developed another way really of working, which made the sculpture, it's a different product, let's put it that way. But I suppose my thinking is, what's the worst that can happen? In a sense, it's already happened, I've been close enough to death to think, that, the worst that can happen in this situation is you die, you get killed or whatever. So that ain't gonna happen if I start making different sculptures. So I can go there. I don't need to, that's the worst. I can get very close to that, but it isn't gonna be the worst. So I suppose that's my philosophy, and maybe, I don't know, Deborah seems to think I take risks. I only take the risk to that point. I'm not going to jump off a bridge on the motorway, because I know what will happen.
Of course.
So against that, everything else is manageable, I suppose.
Yeah.
And if I never sell another sculpture again, ever, all right, well, I'll find some other way of putting bread on the table, as it were. And I don't want to, repeat endlessly, okay, that piece, sold well, so I'll make it again and again and again and again and again. What's the point? that doesn't have any meaning for me.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the thing about, as far as I'm concerned, you know, your life has to have meaning. For me it does.
Of course, yeah.
And I suppose this has meaning, and trying to push the boundaries of what I make is that's the excitement, and that's the meaning.
In terms of your, can I say how old you are?
Of course you can, yes.
You're 82 years.
Yes, I already said I was born in 39, so
well,
it
you
ain't
know, but
difficult.
people never do the math.
Oh, I'm 82 and I'll soon be 83 in April, so there you go.
Who has influenced you most in your life?
That's I've never thought about that. If I'm honest, well, I am honest. If I squeeze it until the pips drop, as it were, I think my kids more than anybody. Because they were little, obviously they've grown up, they're now, obviously grown up, they're adults, and their view of life and what's possible, I think, has been my biggest influence, quite, unconsciously, I'm sure. But, yeah.
And I know that, I'm just going to ask the question, what are you most proud of personally for you?
I've had a life that I think is, back to the thing, but I think it's meaningful. My two kids are great people, and I think I've had quite a lot to do with that, in their attitude to life and their, the way they live their lives. And I've done something with my time which I hope has had some sort of take on other people, that it's had some sort of, it's given them something that, I don't want to be arrogant, but I think
Please
what
be
I've
arrogant.
What?
Please.
I think what I've done has made a few people think, and
It has. It has. It's made me think. I know it's made you guys think, for sure. I just want to say thank you so much, firstly, for having us here in your space today. You released The Art of Survival how long ago now?
Well, the publication date was the 26th of January this year, so whatever it is, a few weeks. I
highly advise the listeners to please read Maurice's book. I could sit here and talk to Maurice for days, I think, and maybe there'll be another podcast, but I could talk to you forever. You have influenced me. I know that people that will be watching this, you will influence them, you will influence my daughter and generations to come through you and through the amazing work that you do. And I'd just like to say thank you for being on the podcast. Well, thank you for making it unstressful and pleasant. I never knew what you were going to ask me, and I know. But thank you, Tracy, and thank you guys for doing the other bit of it.